Hello, everyone. Welcome to Audio Issues Happy Hour. I am your host, Björkfinn Benediktsson, and we will be spending the hour or so, 30 minutes to an hour, depending on how animated we get, answering your questions and having a chat about music production and mixing. If you have a drink like I do, I'm currently drinking the Modern Times Star Cloud. It's a hazy Citra IPA. I'm a big fan of hazy IPAs, even though it is kind of a trendy thing to like. But go with the flow. It's popular. It's tasty. And if you are just joining us for the first time and you're not on the audio issues, you're not following audio issues regularly, I highly recommend going to mixfinisher.com and downloading your mix translation cheat sheet that helps you get your mixes sounding great on every speaker system. Mix translation is a very important part of the mix process. So it's a 7-step process that I put together that is definitely going to help you out. Today we're actually I have a very special guest. Ronan Chris Murphy is joining us, and we'll be talking about production and mixing and answering your questions. But just a quick little read of his bio. He's a multi-genre record producer and engineer that works around the world. His diverse album credits include GWAR, King Crimson, Terry Bozzio, Steve Morse, Ulver, Pete Teo, Jamie Walters, and hundreds more. Yeah, I've known Ronan for a while now, and he always seems to be working on cool projects. So I'm very excited to bring him in. His also, and this was unknown to me until today, that he's also worked on some video games, and his video game credits include Assassin's Creed, Assassin's Creed's Brotherhood, Yoku's Island Express, and Mafia 3. I believe I played Mafia, the first one, back in the day. And he recently mastered the score album for Jordan Peele's hit film Get Out, which won an Oscar, I believe. Yeah, I think so. And I kind of want to dig into how one does that. So I'll be asking just as many questions as you may today. And he works in studios around the world. I know him to be very fond of Italy, and but his own studio, Veneto West. Wow, I'll ask him how to pronounce it, but it's just outside of Los Angeles. And we'll talk to him right now. I'm bringing him in.
Hey, howdy. It's good to be here.
Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. I'm happy we could do this.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, first of all, tell me how
Veneto.
Veneto. Okay.
Veneto.
I was like, is this one of the things that should it sound Italian too, or
Veneto? Veneto Ovest.
Exactly, that's funny. So before we get started, and while we're collecting questions, and feel free to ask any questions you may have in the comment section, whether you're on Facebook, just leave a comment, or in the chat on the right on YouTube. Just let us know how we can help you today. But before we get to the questions, let us know a little bit about yourself, Ronan. What's your elevator? What's your career pitch?
Well, my elevator pitch is weird because it's been just super, super long and weird and winding. I mean, I started as a musician, kind of playing in the kind of punk alternative scene. My weird little footnote in history is that my first band and Dave Grohl's first band are the same band, but we were in it at different times. But but I went on and was kind of playing in sort of that post-hardcore thing and playing with bands like the Flaming Lips and Henry Rollins, not in those bands, but my bands for playing with those kinds of bands.
Cool.
And GWAR a bunch, which of course would come back later to haunt me in life. But my whole thing is, I was in the late, I guess, tail end of the 80s. I was in this band and our bass player quit, and I just wanted to do more music stuff. So a friend of mine lent me a 4-track cassette, and I started messing around with it, and I kind of fell in love, and I realized that I loved it as much as being a dude in a band up on stage and things like that. And I think honestly, I'm better at it than I am at sort of being a rock star. So that kind of worked out really well, but I still play as much as I can. I'm trying to finish up my own album and things like that. And, and my weird, thing for elevator pitch, which we're going up a lot of floors, and one of the things where I got on a lot of people's radar, I'd worked with some pretty major artists, but my other weird footnote in history is being the world's first audio blogger. So I was kind of the first one. I created Ronan's Recording Show, which has been sadly not very active. But, before there's anybody else, before Pat Sato's Place and all that kind of stuff, I started doing it. So when I first started doing it, it was a really kind of weird and surprising thing. So I managed to get on a lot of people's radar pretty quick doing that.
Yeah, the godfather of audio blogging.
There you go. And now I love doing that stuff, but the reality is, I feel blessed by it, but the last few years have been the busiest and most commercially successful of my career. So I love doing I love teaching and sharing because I just love this stuff. I love talking about it, but it's just been a little nuts with working on all the other projects and stuff to try and carve out time where I can sort of do audio blogging, because I don't want to just throw garbage out there for the sake of putting something out there.
Yeah.
So here we are.
Right.
And then I get to be on Audio Issues.
Well, I very much appreciate you coming on. It's always it's fun for me to do these happy hours because let's be honest, it's just an excuse for me to create content and have a drink at the same time.
Perfect.
Whatever people are drinking, do let me know if you're having a beer or a tea or a coffee or whatever. Obviously, this is a worldwide show, so it can be 5 o'clock almost nowhere else. and
there you go.
So, is it correct? You were mixing today, correct?
Yes.
Cool.
So yeah.
Do you have a specific process that you go through when you're mixing? What's your sort of thought process, and do you have a system that you follow?
It changes a lot because kind of as you said in the tee up, I do a really, really wide range of stuff.
Right.
And there are some records, because I work in studios all around the world, and there's some records that I do that are 100% analog on consoles. There are other things that I do that are 100% in the box. So it's always sort of changing. But for me, really, the process of it is, always the first thing is going in and just getting things organized. Getting track labeling, screaming at the heavens if somebody sent me a bunch of tracks that said audio 11 and audio 12 and depending on my mood, sometimes those just get sent back and sometimes I do the work. And actually sometimes if it's really bad and there's tons of crazy tracks, I farm that work out to somebody else.
Yeah.
But really my big thing is kind of getting organized. That's the first, not sexy part of it. Right. But, once you kind of get things organized in a way, not only in terms of labeling, but also in terms of layout in your sessions. Because back in the days when I was mixing mostly on analog consoles, it was really nice because I would lay out tracks on the console in a consistent way. So I knew exactly where lead vocal came up. I knew exactly where kick drum came up. So mixing was like playing a musical instrument. Like if you play guitar, you don't have to think where the strings are for a G major. You just can go to it.
Yeah.
And that was one of the great.
The shape.
Yeah. And your arms stretched out, this far over to the left. So I at least try and get some of that back, kind of knowing for me, like drums are, percussion's always on the bottom with drums on top, then bass, and then lead vocals on top. So at least when I'm going through stuff, I can kind of jump around pretty quickly. But to get into the stuff that's maybe more practical, the first thing I'm working on is levels and panning.
Okay.
And then I do more levels and panning, and then I do some more levels and panning.
Right. It's so important.
Yeah. And then I do a bunch of subtractive EQ.
Okay.
And then probably some more levels and panning.
Yeah.
And for me, my whole thing is
some rebalancing.
Yeah. My mix should sound pretty darn good with levels, panning, and subtractive EQ.
Yeah.
And if it doesn't, unless the tracks are just a disaster, but if it doesn't sound pretty darn good after those things, I haven't done a good job of levels, panning, and subtractive EQ.
Okay.
So I'll go in, work really, really hard to get a mix that's pretty darn good. And then I'll jump into working with dynamics. And always when you add dynamics, you've got to go back and rethink levels, panning, subtractive EQ, and all of those sorts of things. But in my workflow, again, I usually try and have a mix that, would be good enough to go out on the radio before I really get into reverbs and delays or flangers or, any kind of depth or modulation things. Because it's a real big problem a lot of times when people will immediately jump to kind of pouring on the sauce. Because the big problem with that,
guilty of that for sure.
Well, the big problem with that is, when you pour reverb onto something, when you start loading things up with delay, the thing about reverb is reverb masks detail and articulation, and it disconnects the listener from the sound source. And, when you're mixing, you're the listener. Yeah. So when you start piling that stuff early, it's much more difficult to tell where there are structural problems in your mix. It's much harder to say, oh, this is where the conflict is coming with that guitar tone and the lead vocal. So I want to get my mix really, really sounding great before I start piling any of that stuff on.
Right. Yeah. I was watching, I watch a lot of, I obviously, I believe in continued education and continuous improvement, and which means that I have to find people that know, a lot more than me, and so that they can teach me. And I've been watching a bunch of Mix with the Master stuff, and so much of it is, organization and getting things to feel right before you start getting super creative. And it's really funny you should mention like the audio 11, audio 12, because when people send me multi-tracks, there's just a line on the form that asks, have you labeled every single track? And then underneath it, it just says, if you label everything audio 1, audio 2, audio 3, we will never speak again.
And while we've got your captive audience, you probably talked about this before, but a track in a session is called a track, and a stem is a submix of tracks. Right. I don't know what's caused this crazy madness where people are calling tracks stems, but it drives me bonkers. Somebody saying, hey, I'm going to send you stems of stuff. And I'm like, okay, we can work from that. And then, 97 tracks show up. And it's like, no, none of these are stems. And it's okay. I will mix your record from 97 tracks. But, right. But I don't know why that's happening. And, and not just to be a pedagogue about it, but using that term incorrectly. If you're just an amateur doing stuff yourself with nobody else in the world, it doesn't matter. Yeah. But if you start working professionally, you will run into big problems using those two terms incorrectly. Yeah. There are tracks and there are stems. Stems are submixes of particular instruments or groups of instruments.
For sure. Yeah. I just I refer to everything, like the entire list of tracks is just the multi-tracks.
Yep.
And then the stems are the basic groups or whatnot. And you have to kind of use the same language as the people you are working with, and in the industry that has generally accepted jargon,
Yeah. And again, just goofing around with some buddies doesn't matter. But when you start getting into, some of the higher end projects, when you start working with film, when you start working with video games and things like that, major label records, you're talking about things with potentially millions of dollars for those kind of projects. And, with you and the other people on the team, people are paying hundreds and hundreds of dollars per hour. And, if you just make silly, stupid mistakes, you're going to cost people money. Yeah. And if you cost people a lot of money, you will never work with them again.
Right. Right. Yeah, it's a good lesson right there. I wanted to see a few questions here. There's one question from Chris Janton. He's actually he's local, and he asked, do either of you use room correction software these days, like Arc or SonarWorks or anything like that? Do you have that going on in your studio?
Definitely not. Right. There's two things to that. One is, in the current room, I'm really blessed because it's actually a really good sounding room. I've got, my room goes back about, 37 feet or, like 11, 12 meters. Yeah. So I've actually got pretty consistent bass, but I'm not going to tell people not to use those. But the thing about correction software is what they do is they correct for a specific point in the room that's analyzed. Yeah. And one of the things people don't understand is you could have a big problem here and a completely different problem here.
Right. Right.
And here's something I do in my workshops to show people, and I recommend everybody do this like in their own room. Get a test tone generator. Your DAW probably has one. And just do a sine wave and just pick a random low end number like 78 hertz, 85 hertz. And just play that through your speakers, walk around your room, and also sort of squat down, stand up on your tiptoes, and listen to see how much changes in your room. And then select a different frequency, any other low end frequency. If you're at 75, go down to 68, and then do the same thing and listen to see how much changes again, but listen how it's a completely different change. So the problem with all that room correction stuff is that it can only fix things in a certain point, and they can actually do damage to spots in your listening environment that are not those specific points.
Right.
So I'm a much bigger fan of doing room treatment, speaker placement, all those kinds of things.
Yeah.
Before any of those sort of magic bullet kind of things.
Sure. Yeah. So to get my perspective here, Chris. So I have bass traps over here. I have early reflection zones over here. I have some trapping over here and over there. I'm obviously in a converted garage, whereas Ronan is in a professional commercial studio that I'm very jealous of. But I do use, and I recently just got SonarWorks actually, and I did measure my speakers, just the one speakers, and and then I have the headphone calibration too, just to get the monitoring flat, and it made a big difference for me, just in the exact same things that you were talking about, just getting the nodes or the standing waves sort of out of the equation, so I can hear things a little bit better. Where I am right now is there's a big bass bump right in my area here, which will, if untreated and also unrealized, or if I don't know about it, will mean that my mixes will inherently be mixed thinner, because I think there's more bass than there really is. So that's SonarWorks definitely did help me sort of understand that. I turn it off and on, and so like I don't always use it, and introduces some latency, so it's kind of frustrating to use at certain points. But when I am making sure the mixes are, I guess, quote unquote correct, or if I'm making sure that on a flat frequency balance, does it have too much of X, Y, and Z? It's very, very helpful for those sorts of things. Cool. Yeah, hello everyone. G Brown says hello all, and Rodney is enjoying a Stella Artois. And cheers to that. So feel free to post any questions you have in the chat there. But I have I'm just gonna ask some questions, because I'm curious about some of your process. And one of those things, I know we can't go outside anymore, but it's probably a fun story for you to tell, and I definitely think it's a cool one. A few years back, you were in Italy, and you were recording, I don't know which band, but you were doing a lot of basically recording real reverb spaces with, what was it, the Zoom H4 or something like that?
Yeah, different things, but yeah, the Zoom H4n was really extensively used.
Right. So tell me a little bit. Tell us that story. I guess tell me about recording real ancient reverb.
Well, I mean, it's something that I've really gotten into over the last decade or decade and a half. It started years ago with an Italian band called Hypnoise, probably end of the 90s or something. And we were doing a record, and the record, we're doing it all analog, but we wanted to record sort of outdoor spaces. So we were recording on an 8-track reel-to-reel, and we carted that into a church from the 1200s, and carted another analog machine around the canals of Venice. And it was really, really fun and exciting. And then a few years later, another Italian band called Ria Fiora, which is, I think, the one you're referring to. And there's actually a 12-minute documentary about it on YouTube.
Right.
But
I watched it.
So basically what I wanted to do was I wanted sort of the Veneto, that region of North Italy, to be part of the album. And so we recorded the drums, the bass, and some of the heavier guitars like in a studio, but everything else was in remote locations. Wow. And so some of it was just up in a loft in a villa, but some of the lead vocals were cut at 1 a.m. in the middle of St. Mark's Square in an old theater. And the funny thing about it was that it's kind of surprising how decent stuff came out. I mean, the mics in a Zoom H4n are surprisingly good. So, but more importantly, there were a couple songs where we, tracked performances in the studio and then also did them in these kind of outdoor locations. And at mix time, I'd pull them both up, and the ones in the traditional studio were absolutely technically better, but they weren't nearly as exciting. There was just, an excitement in the vocals and even some of the guitar performances that would just felt better. It was more exciting. Yeah. And so it actually helped us make a better record. Right. And the cool thing, like the H4n, which is basically it has a 4-track recorder built into it. So what I would do is I would take, I'd do a mono mix of whatever we're working on, throw that onto track 1, and then we could, anywhere we wanted to, we'd go. And so we'd go, like, especially in Venice, at 2 a.m, we'd, be singing, playing. And then, when the cops came, we'd just run. But it is really fantastic. And one of the things that, I've discovered over the years is when I kind of look back on my career, where I've been lucky to work on hundreds and hundreds of albums, is the ones that are so special to me are those times where I had incredible experiences with people. Yeah. And it is something about when you kind of create these circumstances, a lot of times real elevated art comes out of it. So, so I'm really into that. And if all goes well, actually, there's another album I've been working on off and on for a while with an artist named Kathleen Blackwell. And hopefully on Mother's Day, we're releasing a new single. And that one was an Italian playing handpan in the canals of Venice, and a saz player from Istanbul, Turkey. And we have a percussionist that we recorded in a theater in Oaxaca. Oh, and actually lead vocals tracked in a church in Iceland. So,
oh, really?
Yes.
Do you remember? Do you remember where it was?
Yeah, I wish I could remember the name, and I should look it up. But basically, southeast by the coast, southeast of Reykjavik.
Okay. So kind of close to the glacier lagoon area. And
a little farther, yeah, but yeah, down by the coast, probably about 45 minutes outside of the city. So
okay. Gotcha. Yeah.
I wish I could remember the name.
Right. Well, and it's funny to talk about, and especially just for the audience, that Ronan and I I've bonded a lot about over Iceland, because obviously I'm from there, but he has done a lot of recording there. And we share some sentiments that I won't necessarily go into as to how Iceland has changed throughout the years, some to the better, but a lot sort of to the more frustrating. I wouldn't say to the worst, I would say to the frustrating.
But I started going to Iceland back in the first half of the 90s, like mid 90s, and man, just the art and music scene there was so vibrant. There's still a lot of really cool stuff there now. Yeah. But that place was just, Reykjavik was on fire back in the 90s.
Right. And you're familiar with Arnar Eggert Thoroddsen, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, Curver's brother.
Yes, I know both of them, and yes, we share a common love of old thrash metal and and 80s college rock, and
yeah, he does these music walks around. Well, he used to, but back when tourism was booming in Iceland.
Yeah.
Well, he'd do these music walks around the Reykjavik city center and tell us about, this is Bjork's old apartment where she used to, whatever. And and it was a lot of fun. And he used to interview me back in my alt metal days. So
nice. Yeah. And I met his brother Curver, because I was brought in to help out with Björk did on her biophilia project, kind of doing education in schools. I was brought in to help out a little with that. And I met Curver. He introduced himself, and I was like, "Wait a second, you're Curver?" Because I was actually a fan of his music for 20 years before I met him. So that was kind of cool.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Sorry, we're getting inside baseball on Reykjavik. Sorry, gang.
Yeah. Well, we have some. Jacob asks, "Tell us about your go-to mic. Do you have any?" It's like standard, like I'm always bring this one with me, or things that like that.
Yes. I never have a, this is the mic I always use, especially with vocals. That's changing all the time. But this is actually a very legit question for me, because I actually do a lot of remote recording where we'll take kind of small recording rigs. And the mics, I travel with 3 mics, and I'm not endorsed by Shure in any way, but Shure SM57, a Shure SM7, and a Shure KSM32. Literally those mics, you can record pretty much anything. They're not always the perfect mic, but it's rare. I mean, it's surprising how good the Shure KSM32 is on so much stuff. It's, that's the most underrated mic, I think, in the world. And so it's the kind of thing where I could be recording, percussion or electric guitar or a pipe organ and a 600-year-old pipe organ. And if I show up with those 3 mics, I can get the job done. So those are the 3 mics I travel with when I'm going out and doing remote things, because if I have those, I can do pretty much anything you throw at me.
Very cool.
So and I do, again, I'm also, but in terms of studio stuff, I still, first mic I pull out on a guitar amp is a Shure SM57. Again, not endorsed, but there's a reason it's the most popular guitar mic in the history of the human race and things like that. And on the higher end, I've got like a Perlman TM1. So for my sort of fancy, prettier stuff, like if I want a really shiny acoustic guitar, or vocals where I want more of that big, large diaphragm sound, that's kind of the one I pull up the most.
Very cool. Let's move on to another question here. Hi guys, from Shashikant. I use headphones when I'm using the DAW Compose because others are sleeping. This is very, very very nice of you. Any suggestions as to pros and cons of using headphones during this process?
Yes. In terms of writing and composing, to me, the most important thing is that they're comfortable on your head and that you enjoy listening to them. Things like that. All headphones are messed up. I don't care if you've spent, $39 on your headphones or $6,000 on your headphones. They're completely messed up. Because you're trying to get, the low end of a kick drum. The low end of a kick drum, is this giant wave that where the waveform is, more than 20 feet or 7 meters or something. And you're trying to get that to come out of something the size of this. So there's all sorts of crazy monkey business going on. So when you're getting into critical things about mixing and stuff, that's more of an issue. But for writing and composing, make sure you enjoy them. That's the most important thing about that. And if you are going to get into the, more critical parts sonically, like mixing and things like that, it's just like working in any other environment. The super important thing is to know your environment.
Right.
And that's my thing too, where, because I travel so much to work and I'm working in these different studios, I have a collection of songs that I know incredibly well. I know the mixes. I know exactly how far the low end extends. I know exactly where the vocals sit in relationship to the guitar. So I'll bring those with me. And for the most part, you can drop me down in a studio and give me 20-minute listening session with the songs I know, and I can start doing some work that sort of makes sense. So headphones would be the same. Like if you're going to start mixing your own stuff, pull up records that are similar to the mix you're doing that you think are outstanding and really compare side by side to see what you're doing in relation to the records you love. That doesn't mean you have to match them, but if you notice that, like, wow, my bass is way out front compared to these other songs, if that's what you're going for, great. But a lot of times you might be kind of just missing the mark just because you're not super familiar with your listening environment.
Right. Yeah, I would say, yeah, especially when you're creating, convenience and comfort is like number one. Well, I guess number one and two. And then mixing, when you're mixing, just make sure that it translates.
Yep.
Uh, cool. Dave asks, any tricks for getting that big rock guitar sound, lead and rhythm?
Yes. SM57 on a tube amp. And I know that I'm going to sound something like an elitist jerk for saying that. But I I'm completely cool with anybody who uses any tools they want and gets the sound they love.
Yeah.
But for me, a single SM57 on a decent tube guitar amp just works in a way that's it's so much easier to get that guitar to be big. Well, actually, let me back up. It's easier to get that guitar to be big in a way that also allows other elements in the mix to be big. Because the problem I have with so many of the kind of digital modeling options is you can get these gargantuan guitar sounds, but they'll eat up your lead vocal for lunch. They'll eat up your cymbals and all those other kind of things. So it's this battle.
Yeah.
So for me, the traditional way of putting a mic on an amp, it's just so much easier. And even if when somebody sends me a record to mix, a lot of times I'll check to see how they did the guitars, because that will sort of allow me to gauge the amount of time that I'm going to have to spend mixing the record to get it to sound amazing. And I don't say that from a religious point of view. If I tried a modeler, tomorrow morning and it did what I was looking for, I'd be happy to use it all the time. I'd be even happy to use a modeler if it, I've got a bunch of super high end tube amps over there, but if I plugged in a modeler and it matched or beat for a particular sound, I'd be totally happy to use it. So there's no, again, religious thing, but
not a purist on the issue.
But let me back off to something that's and say something that's more practical, because again, a lot of, like the guy who asked the question before, your kids are sleeping in the next room. You don't get to dime out the Marshall and, and do those kind of things. And so we are working with modelers and stuff. You might have to work with modelers a lot, but the biggest thing you can do about big rock guitar sounds, and this is the huge mistake people make, is the more gain and saturation you have on the guitar, the smaller it will sound. Because saturation, real high gain and saturation, does some really extreme compression, and it takes off the transients and it smears the guitar sound. And I'm a guitar player. It's really fun to play guitar with a lot of saturation. It's a real balancing act, because when you want to start cranking up the gain to get a little bit of excitement, there's a point that comes pretty darn quickly where the more and more you crank up the gain, the smaller and smaller your guitar will sound. And listen to an AC/DC record.
I was just gonna say, like, AC/DC is a perfect example of this.
I mean, they're an extreme example. I mean, especially if you listen like the first three records, they're comically clean guitars.
Yeah.
And even on their most extreme stuff, on a scale of 1 to 10, they crank it up to about a 3.
Right.
And that's why a lot of records, for especially 80s, where guitar was such a big present thing, most of those guitars, even Motley Crue and some of the Metallica stuff, is on the cleaner side. When we started hitting the 2000s, people started getting into this detuned, super saturated kind of thing, which is fine, but those sounds are actually pretty soft and wimpy. And what you'll find is a lot of the guitar players who use those really extreme things is on those mixes, the drums drive it. So you find like a rock record from the 80s where the guitars are cleaner, the guitars drive it. Mm-hmm. But if you listen to a lot of more modern metal stuff with really high gain, the power is actually coming from the drums or the drum samples in so many cases, or the guys are playing palm muted. Mm-hmm. And when you palm mute, you're actually kind of cutting down on the sustain and saturation there. So one is not good or bad, but it is the kind of thing where, like dialing in high gain, it's the same thing about, you pour a lot of sugar into the recipe you're making, it's going to get really sweet. And you pour in a lot of gain on your guitars, it's going to get really soft and start to start to push back in the mix with the same level.
Yeah, softness is an interesting way of putting it, because like one of the guitar sounds I kept chasing back in the day was the Tool sound from like Einema and Undertow.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like this rock guitar sound that's kind of like a punch in the face, and it has like this fullness to it that then, you know, compare that to maybe a little bit some of the later records that seems like the gain has gone up a little bit, but also compare that to the records of that time, or later on in that time, like the new metal era, where everything gets just like super sludgy in a way.
Yeah. And
you know?
oh, sorry to cut you off, but a huge difference with that also is that, you know, and Einema, which is just a masterwork. I mean, David Bottrell's work just humbles me on that record.
So
Is most big sounding records that have rock guitar, the guitars don't have any low end on them. And that's a mistake a lot of people make, is they'll pile in a bunch of low end on the guitar and then wonder why the guitars don't punch. It's, well, that's another thing, like the saturation. A lot of low end will mush your guitars kind of into the other stuff. And again, that's not morally wrong. I mean, Caius's Welcome to Sky Valley is probably the coolest record ever made. And that, you know, and those guitars just have a lot of low sludgy and they just blend in with the bass, and it's beautiful and it's perfect, but it's a very particular thing. Right. You're never going to get that kind of guitar to play the role of what you'd find on a Tool record or a Metallica record or a Motley Crue record, or, you know, or a Travis Tritt record, or whatever you're into.
Right. Yeah. But going back to the AC/DC example, I can't remember where I read it, but I remember the engineer talking about how one track was much cleaner. Maybe it's Malcolm's track, that's the rhythm is much cleaner, and that's like pan to the right or the left. And then Angus's track is on the opposite side, and it's a little more distorted, but it's more like an overdrive than a distortion, you know?
Yeah, most AC/DC is right into the amp. And also the traditional old setup was Angus's guitar would have a little bit more mid-range too, so they weren't competing. So more of the top end and the cleaner low would come over from Malcolm, who's the real heart of AC/DC. And then Angus would have this little more saturated mid-rangey sound, and they would sort of, you know, create this big, you know, punch in the face that way.
Yeah. Well, cool. Well, that was a fun journey into guitar sounds. I hope that was helpful, Dave. Let's go to R. Brown. Going back to mixing, would it be too specific to talk about the challenges mixing bass and kick drum in a more typical rock style music? I don't think it's too specific. This is a very particular and common problem, and we both like rock music very much.
Yes. There's a couple things. One is if you want your kick and bass to sort of be big, have sort of bigness and presence, which we do a lot of times. One is you can't have a lot of other stuff fighting it. You can't have that jerk guitar player with all that low end in his guitar.
Just turn up the filter.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, high pass filtering. I do so much high pass filtering on records. Yeah. But so a big thing is to make sure, because low end is this beast, and low end elements do not like to play well with others.
Right.
So they will go in and fight each other. And the net result is usually just boring. Again, backing up, Caius's Welcome to Sky Valley is perhaps the coolest record ever made. And that's complete opposite of everything I'm saying now. But the other two things, again, clear out real estate so that you really only have two elements down there. And that on a rock record, that's usually kick drum and a bass guitar, but that also could be a synth loop on a pop track or trap or something like that. Make sure you don't have competition in there. Also make sure that the kick and bass aren't fighting for real estate within themselves, because usually one thing can have low end in my mix. And depending on the style of music, even depending on what the bass player plays, the kick drum plays, really only letting one of those have the low end. And the other big thing, and this is just one of my giant things, is drummers and even some non-drummers have this crazy, ridiculous thing about thinking that they like length on drums, that a kick drum will go, you know, have length to it, boom, boom.
Right.
And that's totally fine as long as nothing else is in the band. So if it was a kick drum record, that is a beautiful, beautiful thing. But we don't get to make those records very often. So one of the big things is shortening up the kick drum. I'm almost always, shortening the kick drum when I'm recording it myself. I will get the kick drum to be short at the source.
Yeah.
Somebody sends me something to mix. I'm using things like Elysia Envelope or SPL Transient Design to shorten that, because when you shorten that, it'll define the kick drum and let that actually articulate through the bass. So if you have things with their own sort of real estate and you have the kick drum being more articulated, you can kind of get away with both of those being big. And on a side note, I did this whole like 12-hour drum recording course called Drum Recording Boot Camp. And don't go buy it today, because when I get some time this week, I'm going to lower the price like $150. So don't buy it today, but keep an eye out for Drum Recording Boot Camp. But I go into that in detail and really show you, because when you shorten the length of drums, they punch and articulate. And when drums have length to them, they compete with other elements in the mix and they smear back. It's the same thing with high gain guitars. So yeah, if you want your stuff to be big and punchy, shorten the length of your drums and clean up your guitars. And that's going to do more than any other production trick or mixing trick I or anybody else could tell you.
Yeah. Yeah. So to piggyback on that, there's actually a video on my channel in the mix stream playlist one. I'm giving an example of this Alice in Chains style rock mix, and I'm using both a transient designer and a gate to actually shorten the release and the bigness of the kick drum itself. So definitely check that out if you have some time to, you need more tips.
And gates can be really cool. I use them less than I used to. The one thing you got to always be careful of if you're using gates on kick drums is to make sure that if you actually have a dynamic drummer, you can actually lose things. So if you've got something coming out of a bridge where you've got this dun 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 crescendo, it could end up being dun dun, and the drummer probably won't be stoked about that when you send them the mix.
No, not at all. Well, cool. I hope that was helpful. Let's move on to Bob Gardner. He is an Insiders member of mine, and actually he was gracious enough to allow me to use one of his songs in as the background music to my my YouTube videos that I release on Fridays. And he says he struggles to get his mixes well balanced across the frequency spectrum. Any suggestion about how to achieve translation, I guess?
Yes. Two big things. Really, it's about balance across the spectrum, is giving each element within your mix its role. A lot of us have the challenge of, like, we want our guitar to sound amazing. We want our synth pad to sound amazing. We want all those cool things. We put them together and our mix doesn't sound amazing. So you really have to be pretty aggressive about saying, okay, acoustic guitar, this is where you get to live. Organ, you get to live here. Maybe they can have a little overlap. But, and really, the thing I would recommend doing is, especially if you're doing something that's, not on a client's dime or schedule, try going into your mixes and doing that really extreme. Like, cut off the low end of that acoustic guitar way more than you would ever think would be realistic. And then, same thing, cutting all the top end off of that B3 organ than you'd ever think would be realistic, and getting things to fit in their own thing. And when you sort of think of your mix in terms of these frequency building blocks, and then panning those out, it's amazing how much that comes together. And I do a ton also when the mid-range is the tough part, because especially when you're talking on a rock record, what's in the mid-range? Well, everything. Guitar, lead vocal, kick, snare, cymbal, da-da-da-da-da-da, and everything wants that same real estate. So in my mixes, I'm doing a ton of high-pass filtering, and I'm doing a ton of subtractive EQ in the mids, just to get everything to find its place. And one of the cool things too is, even if you just sort of like push up a parametric EQ and sort of sweep back and forth, even before you develop a sense of knowing what will work and what won't, it's just, if you do that and kind of pan back and forth, you'll go, oh wait, that frequency kind of sounds like crap.
Yeah.
Mix tip: when stuff sounds like crap, have there be less of the stuff that sounds like crap in your mix. And it's amazing when you sort of start pulling those frequencies down that aren't beautiful to your ear. And again, your idea of beautiful might not be the same as mine, but when you start taking those elements that aren't beautiful to you and reducing that amount, it tends to actually expose elements that are beautiful in other instruments.
Yeah.
So again, I'm a huge fan of subtractive EQ. I'm not opposed to boosting at all. I mean, some records I don't boost at all, and some I do a fair amount. And I don't want to say that that's the only way to do it, because I mean, I think Chris Lord-Alge is incredibly talented, and he boosts the crap out of everything. So,
right.
But for me personally, I've just found with subtractive EQ and working that way has actually developed my ears a lot. I'm really fast at it now.
Right.
And I've actually even in workshops, done like kind of mix walkthroughs where I've, just done only subtractive EQ on a rock mix. And then we put it up against something Chris Lord-Alge did. And I'm not going to say mine's better or as good or anything like that, but it had that same level of excitement and power and things like that, only with subtractive EQ. So it's, for me, that works better. And also find too, when I do a lot of subtractive EQ to solve those frequency problems, when I do get around to boosting, even small boosts are really, really dramatic. Where if you start with boosting, even big boosts actually don't sound that dramatic.
Right. Well, it's funny, going back to your acoustic guitar comment earlier about like, well, it doesn't need all that. And that goes back to thinking about what is its purpose in the mix. For instance, if it's just supposed to be a strummy guitar in the background that's just supporting some other thing, it doesn't need any of those low mids. It doesn't need a ton of like thickness or anything like that. If you just want the sparkliness of the strings to come through to support, then just take it out. Take everything else out.
And I would encourage all of your viewers, if you're recording acoustic guitars, definitely try again. You should have some good dynamic moving coil dynamic mics around.
Yeah.
SM57, EV RE20, Sennheiser 421, just at least one of those. And it's been really, really, really rare that I haven't been able to get a better sound on an acoustic guitar with one of those than taking the direct out from the guitar, just in terms of getting them to sound at least the way that's pleasing to me and to work better into mixes. And it's not expensive. So it's not saying, hey, you need a $7,000 Neumann to do this. Like, no, you need a Craigslist $80 dynamic mic.
Right.
And people often overlook just how awesome moving coil dynamics can be on acoustic guitars. And which is sad, because they often have one sitting right next to them and they just plug in direct and wonder why their guitar sounds like plastic.
Right. Well, cool. Let's move on to this is I probably know the answer to this question, but I'm gonna let you answer it anyway. Is it true that you do one-on-one consulting by way of video chat in addition to all your record producing and engineering?
Whoever that is, I'll just send me your address. I'll send you that check. But no, I mean, just like you, I know you do it as well. Yeah. But yeah, the funny thing too is, I mean, luckily the kind of mixing and mastering work's been really busy, still busy right now. But it's funny, with more people kind of stuck at home, work, like having time to do their recording projects, I'm actually doing more of that. So for people interested in that, at recordingbootcamp.com, there's a link for consulting on that. Yeah. And I do that for people all over the world. So it's kind of funny just waking up and going, okay, so I was talking with somebody in India today, and now somebody from Seattle, and now I'm going to mix a record for somebody. So, but no, and I love doing that, because, it's this great thing where you get to, I'd hang out and talk about this stuff for free with people because I like it. And the fact that people actually send you some money via PayPal to talk about this stuff is fantastic.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, for sure. All right. Christopher asks, long live Veneto West. Can you get a reasonable reproduction of analog drums from digitally recorded drum tracks in the mix?
Yes, and Christopher Boulay is actually an extremely cool American that lives in North Italy, and very, very cool musician. So if there's links or anything, check out what he does. Yeah. But close enough where I don't fret about it. You know, I don't fret about the platform very much. And, you know, my whole thing is, I was an early adopter. I've always bounced around. I did my first mix in the box in 1993. So it's all kind of stuff. But the nice thing about tracking drums to analog is there's a certain kind of compression that happens with analog tape that's different than the options we have in the digital domain. And, you know, especially if you're recording at slower tape speed, there's kind of a thickening in the low end that is, you know, slightly different than what we can do with our digital tools. And I think a lot of people might get too caught up on the platform that they're recording to. And one of the things I see a lot of times is people will fuss about that and jump through hoops without really spending time getting the drums to sound right. Because again, I can analog or digital, and you know, especially if I can use a couple plugins to sort of mock some of the artifacts of analog, I could get you something where you're not going to notice a huge difference. But getting the drums to be right, to have that feel like, if you know, oh, I want the drums to feel like this record from the 70s.
Right.
Well, there's things we can do in terms of treating the drums on that. You know, throwing a tea towel over the snare drum will get you way closer to that than tracking to 2-inch analog.
Right.
And instead of a, you know, a really live snare drum, tracking to digital or analog, one of the others.
Right.
But yeah, and actually, you know, I don't really care if tape plugins sound really like tape. But I do find some of them to be useful in terms of giving us some of that characteristics that we associate with analog. I use the soft tube one a lot, kind of when I want that, and I'll play around with some others, but that tends to be the one that I reach for when I want to kind of create some of that vibe. Yeah.
Cool. Very cool. All right. Let's go. Well, we maybe kind of covered this already. What are the best tips on recording a loud guitar cab? SM57. And if you want to get fancy, maybe add a ribbon alongside of it.
I'll throw my opinion. 57 is usually my first go-to, even though I will, if that's not working, I'll go through any mics we want. I'm a huge fan of single mics on guitar cabinets, because anytime you multi-mic something, you are 100% guaranteed to introduce phase problems. Anybody who says, oh yeah, I used the ribbon and a SM57 and I got the phase perfect, is like, you're either ignorant or lying. You didn't. Your recording has phase problems, and those phase problems are most likely having a negative impact on your guitar sound. They may do something cool that outweighs the negative impact on your guitar sound, and that's fine. So I'm not saying don't do it, but a lot of people make the mistake of, like, they put one mic on and then they add another mic and it's, wow, it's so much better. I'm like, sure is, man. It's 6 dB better.
Yeah,
but the thing that I'll recommend with this is, if you are going to use multi-mic stuff, really try and do some tests, like record your, whatever your dynamic, record your ribbon, and then, you know, sum those down, your level match those, and really listen to the differences, because it's amazing how often you go, oh, actually that's not better. And you know, I did the last album for the band GWAR, which, you know, I was happy to see, like, lots of really good talk about the guitar sounds and stuff on that. And 98% of that record is a single SM57 on a Marshall 412 cabinet for the whole album.
Yeah, it just works.
Yeah. And by the way, go to GWAR.net. They did an album called Scumdogs of the Universe 30 years ago, which is kind of their iconic classic. And I got to remix that for the 30th anniversary. So the box set just came on sale this week. So,
oh, very cool.
And it's really expensive, but if you're a super GWAR fan, you're cool with that.
Yeah, right. David Manto asks, what about parallel compression on the bass when getting it to work well with the kick? That's something that I tend to do a lot. I have a parallel bass bus on my mix template that has most of the low end rolled off, and tape saturation, or a saturation plugin of some sort. and then well, in one of the last mixes I did, and then I added like a fuzz pedal on top of that, which was kind of cool.
Yeah, I tend to do something similar. Just to let my little pea brain work fast, I usually just mult the track.
Yeah.
So I'll duplicate the bass track, or if they've sent me sort of, here's a mic, here's a DI, or multiple options. So
Right.
I'll duplicate the track and usually have basically each track playing different roles. So one might be sort of the round, round clean thing, and another one being more aggressive. And actually cool tracking trick is a lot of times, I love amps, but actually with bass, I record DI a lot. And I've got a really good DI collection, some real high-end stuff, but I'll usually go for kind of a cleaner DI, and then like the Sansamp bass driver, which just sounds stupid on its own, but when you blend that in with a nice big round thing, it's really beautiful because you can make them sound really different. And because they're both DI, they're both perfectly in phase in the audio spectrum.
Nice.
But yeah, I do the equivalent of parallel a lot, but just in terms of my workflow, I'll just tend to duplicate that.
Yeah.
And keep things simpler and just treat the two tracks differently.
Very cool. Very cool. GWAR asks, would you say bass lowest and kick above, say, at 100 to? So I guess where are these things? Well, what do you think? And they're all over the place.
It depends on the performance.
Right.
So again, usually one thing that everything I'm saying has exceptions to it.
Yeah.
But a lot of times, if like the bass is doing like a straight eighth note, dong dong gong 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 gong, or even like dub style with a lot of sustain on there,
right,
that'll get the low end, and then the kick drum will have that. If you've got something where the maybe the bass is playing higher and more spacious, boo-doo-doo,
yeah,
boo-doo-doo-doo, there's room to let the kick drum sort of have that. But it's really important. Like years ago, I did a video or blog or something called "Nobody Has Ever Asked Me for the Bass Sound in Kashmir," which actually has this beautiful boom, boom, low end on the kick drum. And the reason nobody asked for it is, one, there's no bass on that track. Zeppelin were brilliant arrangers, and they knew that wouldn't work. So there's actually a keyboard in there going dunk, 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 playing that role. But that's the thing, really, it's usually the thing that is more consistent will have we'll take the low end, but it's really rare that I'll have stuff below 100 hertz on both of those instruments, or if I am, they're sort of carved out in different places below then.
Right.
But and the role they're going to play, because in more like modern metal kind of things, or even modern rock and pop, there's a lot more action up around like 4K and stuff to get that to pop through and articulate. Yeah. But if it's more about the bass drum being a support role and filling up room, I might allocate the low end of that. But it changes on every mix, even on the same album.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say like what is more consistent gets the low end, because that makes so much sense to me when I think about like if it isn't consistent, that low end is just going to drop out of the mix like it's like irregularly, and it's just sound weird, right?
Yep.
Yeah. Anyway, cool. G Brown asks, when mixing drums, do you include percussion when bussing, or do you have a separate bus for drums? So I guess this is a broader question that I'd love your input on is how do you bus your instruments?
It used to be more consistent when I was on an analog console. It changes up a little bit more. But most of the time, I've got drums are going to a dedicated bus. Percussion is usually not part of that. Just because I'm usually trying to get percussion to play a slightly different role than the drum set.
Yeah.
But if things aren't gelling, I will throw it in there. But I usually keep those separate. And then I'm generally bussing big groups, like if there are big choir stacks, if there are big horn sections, if there are strings, all those kinds of things, I'll usually bus those together. But most of the other things, I'm kind of not doing a lot of bussing. Like if I've got two guitars on the record, I'm rarely creating a guitar bus and things like that. And part of this is just a little bit of paranoia too. When you're mixing on an analog console, your audio is perfectly in phase in the audio spectrum. And when you're doing a lot of bussing in the DAW, it gets it pretty close. And So it's one of those things where I'm always a little bit shy, because on a console I would do a lot more. You know, I would have something that would run to a parallel bus, and then that would feed off to another drum bus, which might feed a whole rhythm section. So there was a lot of stuff flying around, but you know, DAWs just can't keep up with that. So I think my workflow has sort of changed to a little bit, but mostly it's drums get their own bus. If there are multiple bass tracks, a lot of times they'll get their own bus just for a global kind of compression or processing. And then really big groups, but most other stuff, I'll generally just have it going straight to my my mix bus.
Very cool. Very cool. Yeah, and similar to me, I have if there's percussion, I'll have a separate percussion bus, and then I'll have a drum bus, and then depending on the complexity of the drum kit itself, there are sub buses there too as well.
Yeah.
Cool. I think we have time for one more question at least. Let's talk about overhead mic positioning on drums.
Excellent. It's when I was first kind of learning how to do recording or having interest in this stuff, I saw a picture of a drum recording session from Van Halen 2. And I saw where they put the drum overheads, and I'm like, oh, I guess that's how you do it. And that's kind of stuck with me for a few decades. But I like to work most of the time with space pairs of cardioid mics.
Yeah.
With the space pairs, we are 100% guaranteed to have phase problems. So I'm always checking for monocompatibility on that, making sure it's not too out of whack. But one of the things I love about the space pairs is I can do a lot of my drum mixing with my overheads. So just being able to, oh, wow, this floor tom's not cutting through, and the ride cymbal's a little loud. It's like, all right, well, let's just move that over there. So I can kind of mix with that. So I'm doing that. I'm always experimenting with height, because height will have a huge difference on both sort of the sense of space and ambience, but also in terms of if the drums feel more blended or more articulate, and depending on the kind of music you're doing, one can be better than the other. So I'm always playing around with those. Unless I get asked to do otherwise, I'm always mixing in right-handed drummer's perspective, because I like to play air drums when I mix, and just left-handed just is too complicated for me. But that's the big thing. It's usually just two mics. And my whole thing too is most of the time, if I'm tracking a record, I try and get my drum sounding fantastic with three mics: a mic on the kick drum, and my overheads, which again, sometimes can be XY pair, sometimes can be OTRF. They can sometimes be space pairs in front. So I'll do whatever it takes to get it there. Right. But my whole thing is I want to get the drum sounding great with three mics. And then everything else is supplemental. And, you know, just as a cool business tip for you guys who do this professionally, like if you can get the drums just really sounding slamming with three mics, which of course means going in and having the fight with the drummer about getting him to tune the drums correctly for the style thing you're making. Right. If you can get the band to come in and go, oh man, those drums sound great, you can just say, oh yeah, that's just three mics. We'll get them a little punchier with the other mics. All of a sudden they're like, oh, this guy. Yeah. And I'm being a little bit sarcastic, but not really. But if on day one, the band has just seen you with three mics, getting a drum that sounds like an awesome record, when you start having discussions about how to do the guitars or how to record vocals or horns or anything like that, there's going to be a position of trust that's different if they haven't heard kick-ass stuff from you yet.
Right. Yeah, you will have achieved that much needed respect. Yeah, very cool. I have to feature this comment because my buddy Tino here is he has one of my favorite reviews of the step-by-step mixing book that I released a few years ago. It basically said I was a songwriter and composer or something like that, and now I call myself a mixing engineer. So
awesome.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite. It's also Amazon's favorite review, because if you go to the Amazon listing, it's the featured one. So
nice.
Well, thanks so much for coming on, Ronan. This was great. A lot of fun talking to you, and I hope it was helpful to everyone else. And yeah, Yeah. So
And if you want to contact me, just go to ronanchrismurphy.com.
yeah.
Recording boot camp, and I'm pretty easy to find out there on the Google machine.
Cool. So ronanchrismurphy.com, recording boot camp. And he does all sorts of things. He'll talk to you about recording, music production. And when the world opens up, you might be able to join him in Italy for one of his on-location recording.
Yes, or we've had that bummer about the pandemic. There's lots of real-world problems. But yeah, we were actually we do a recording retreat in West Virginia every year that was supposed to be starting in 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Great registrations, but we've pushed it back till end of August, and I hope we can actually do that. But
Yeah.
yes, but I miss getting to hang out with people and make music together.
Right. Well, cool. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. Hope you enjoyed it. And as always, cheers and cheers.
Great. Thanks for having me.